The relentless Arizona sun beat down upon Jonathan Muir's shoulders, each ray a hammer blow against the worn brim of his hat. His farm, usually a sanctuary of cultivated order carved from the harsh, unforgiving land, felt different this sweltering afternoon. A disquiet, sharp as a shard of obsidian, had pricked at him since dawn. His horse, Old Bess, had been skittish, her ears swiveling, nostrils flaring at scents only she could discern on the hot, shimmering air. He'd dismissed it as a coyote, perhaps, or a stray longhorn, but the unease lingered, coiling in his gut like a desert rattler. He paused his mending of a fence line, the wire biting into his calloused palm, and squinted towards the dense thicket of mesquite and palo verde that bordered his southernmost field. It was there, amidst the tangled green and thorny branches, that Bess had shied most violently earlier, her whinnies edged with a terror Jonathan hadn't heard in years. He'd seen nothing then, only the dance of heat haze and the buzz of unseen insects, but the feeling, that cold premonition, it clung to him. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his gaze sweeping the seemingly empty expanse. This land had been his solace since Martha passed, her laughter and warmth stolen by the fever 5 winters gone. The silence she left behind was a constant companion, a hollow echo in the sturdy farmhouse he'd built with his own hands. He often spoke to her in his thoughts, narrating his days, the small victories of crops taking root, the quiet majesty of a desert sunset. Today, however, his thoughts were fractured, his senses on high alert. He lowered his tools, a deep furrow in his brow. The silence from the thicket was too profound, too absolute. Even the cicadas seemed to have muted their incessant chorus. With a grin set to his jaw, Jonathan walked towards the dense brush, his boots kicking up puffs of ochre dust. He pushed aside a low-hanging branch, its leaves brittle and dry, and peered into the shadowed interior. At first, he saw nothing but dappled shade and the rough texture of bark. Then, a patch of color, unnaturally dark against the pale earth, caught his eye. A moccasin, small and beaded, lay half-buried in the dirt. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pushed further in, the thorns snagging at his canvas shirt. And then he saw him. A boy, no older than 10 summers, lay crumpled at the base of a gnarled mesquite, still as death. His skin, the rich hue of copper, was marred by angry, crimson stains. Bullet holes, at least 3, stark and brutal against the child's slender frame. His dark hair was matted with blood and dirt, his face turned to the side, cheek pressed into the unforgiving ground. For a long moment Jonathan could only stare, the horror of it a physical blow. This was Apache land, or had been, before the blue-coated soldiers and the relentless tide of settlers like himself had pushed them further into the desolate mountains. He'd heard whispers in town, dark tales of skirmishes, of brutal reprisals. This boy, this child, was a victim of that bitter, unending conflict. A profound sorrow, sharp and piercing, lanced through Jonathan. A grief that echoed the loss of Martha, the loss of his own stillborn son years before. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and gently reached out a hand, expecting to find the coldness of death. But as his fingers brushed the boy's dusty arm, he felt it the faintest, most fragile tremor of life, a pulse like the flutter of a trapped bird's wing. Hope, fierce and unexpected, surged through him. He couldn't leave him here. He wouldn't. This child, regardless of his blood or his people, deserved a chance. With a grunt of effort, Jonathan carefully scooped the boy into his arms. He was lighter than a sack of feed, yet carried the weight of a world's worth of cruelty. The boy's head lolled against his chest, a faint, ragged breath ghosting across Jonathan's neck. "Hold on, son," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Just hold on." He turned, his steps urgent, carrying the broken child away from the place of violence, towards the uncertain sanctuary of his home, the sun blazing down as if to sear the moment into his very soul. The future was a vast, unwritten page, but in that instant Jonathan Muir knew one thing with absolute certainty. His life, and the life of this Apache boy, had been irrevocably changed. The journey back to the farmhouse was a torment of careful haste. Each jolt of Jonathan's stride sent a fresh wave of pain through his own aging frame, but his concern was solely for the child nestled against his chest. The boy remained limply unconscious, his breathing shallow, a fragile thread that Jonathan feared might snap at any moment. The sun, now beginning its slow descent, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with unspoken menace. Jonathan's mind raced. He was no doctor, his medical knowledge limited to treating livestock and the occasional minor injury to himself. The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was a good 2 hours' ride, and Doc Miller, while competent, was often overwhelmed. More pressing was the question of how the boy would be received, even if he survived. Anti-Apache sentiment ran deep, fueled by fear and prejudice, fanned by tales of raids and retribution. Bringing an Apache child, a survivor of what was likely a cavalry massacre, into that volatile mix was akin to carrying a lit torch into a powder keg. Yet, the thought of abandoning him, of turning his back on this flicker of life, was anathema to everything Jonathan believed. He reached his small, whitewashed adobe home, the scent of wood smoke from Mrs. Gable's kitchen a welcome familiarity. As he approached the porch, the screen door creaked open and Martha Gable, his housekeeper and confidant for the past 3 years, stepped out. She was a woman whose stern countenance belied a heart of immense kindness, a widow herself, her pragmatic nature a grounding force in Jonathan's solitary life. Her eyes, sharp and observant, widened first in surprise, then in alarm as she took in the sight of the bloodied child in Jonathan's arms. "Lord have mercy, Jonathan! What in heaven's name?" she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Found him in the south field, Martha," Jonathan said, his voice strained. "Bullet riddled. He's alive, but barely." Without another word, Mrs. Gable pushed the door wider, her initial shock already giving way to a focused urgency. "Bring him in. Lay him on the settee in the parlor. I'll fetch water and bandages. We need to send for Doc Miller." Straight away, Jonathan carefully carried the boy inside, the cool dimness of the house a stark contrast to the glare outside. He laid him gently on the worn floral settee, the child's small form looking utterly lost against its faded grandeur. Mrs. Gable was already bustling, her movements efficient and purposeful. She returned with a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a roll of linen bandages she kept for emergencies. As she began to carefully clean the grime and blood from around the wounds, her expression was a mixture of grim determination and profound sadness. "So young," she murmured, her voice tight with emotion. "Just a babe, really? Who could do such a thing?" Jonathan didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the boy's still face. The child's features, though contorted in what seemed like a permanent grimace of pain, held a certain proud nobility. He dispatched his young ranch hand, Tom, a lad of 16, to ride for Doc Miller, urging him to make haste. Then, he returned to the parlor, watching as Mrs. Gable worked with gentle expertise. The bullets, it appeared, had passed through a small mercy, but the damage was severe, the risk of infection immense. The wait for the doctor stretched into an eternity, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall amplifying the tension. Jonathan found himself praying, something he hadn't done with such fervor since Martha's illness. He prayed for this unknown child, for a life he had, in a single desperate moment, chosen to save. The shadows deepened outside, and the lamps were lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over the somber scene. Finally, the sound of hoofbeats and a carriage announced Doc Miller's arrival. The doctor, a portly man with kind eyes and weary lines etched around them, entered, his bag in hand, his expression serious as he surveyed the small patient. He listened to Jonathan's terse account, his gaze never leaving the boy. The examination was swift, his touch surprisingly gentle for such large hands. He cleaned the wounds with carbolic, stitched where necessary, and applied poultices. His prognosis, when he finally straightened, was guarded. "He's lost a lot of blood, Jonathan. The infection is the main worry now. These wounds, they're nasty." He looked from Jonathan to Mrs. Gable. "He'll need constant care." And luck. A good deal of luck. Days bled into nights, a blur of anxious vigil and whispered prayers. The Apache boy, whose name they did not know, hovered in the shadowed valley between life and death. Fever consumed him, his small body burning with an intensity that terrified Jonathan. He thrashed on the settee, his cries a torrent of Apache words, sharp and guttural, interspersed with whimpers that tore at Mrs. Gable's heart. Jonathan, despite his exhaustion, rarely left his side. He sat in the old rocking chair Martha had favored, watching the boy's chest rise and fall with each ragged breath. In those fevered deliria, fragments of the boy's ordeal surfaced, images of uniformed men on horseback, the crack of rifles, screams, the scent of smoke and terror. Jonathan's jaw would tighten, his hands clenching into fists, a cold rage simmering within him at the brutality inflicted upon this child and his people. Mrs. Gable was a pillar of strength, her practical care unwavering. She bathed the boy's hot skin with cool water, spooned broth between his cracked lips when he could swallow, and changed his dressings with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Doc Miller came daily, his expression grim but not entirely without hope. "He's a fighter, this one," he'd said after one particularly rough night. Got a spirit tougher than old leather. Jonathan learned the contours of the boy's face, the way his long lashes fanned against his cheekbones, the stubborn set of his chin even in unconsciousness. He saw not an enemy, not an Apache, but a child vulnerable and in desperate need. The past sorrow of his own lost son mingled with a fierce, protective instinct for this new, fragile life under his roof. He found himself talking to the boy, soft murmurs in the quiet hours of the night. He spoke of the farm, of the changing seasons, of the stars that blazed in the vast desert sky. He didn't know if the words registered, but it soothed something within himself to speak them. One afternoon, nearly a week after Jonathan had carried him from the field, the fever broke. The boy's skin, though still pale, was cool to the touch. His breathing, while shallow, was more regular. Jonathan, slumped in his chair, half asleep, was startled awake by a subtle shift. The boy's eyes, dark as polished obsidian, were open. They fixed on Jonathan, wide and filled with a raw, primal fear. He tried to recoil, a small, choked sound escaping his lips, but he was too weak. Jonathan slowly raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. "Easy now, son," he said, his voice gentle, barely above a whisper. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The boy stared, his gaze unwavering, searching Jonathan's face for any sign of threat. The fear was palpable, a wild, untamed thing. But beneath it, Jonathan thought he saw a flicker of something else, confusion, perhaps, and a dawning awareness of his surroundings. Mrs. Gable entered quietly, a cup of broth in her hand. She stopped when she saw the boy awake, a soft smile touching her lips. "Well now, look who's decided to join the living." The boy's gaze darted to her, then back to Jonathan. He remained utterly still, like a cornered animal. Jonathan reached for a dipper of water. "Thirsty?" he asked, holding it out. The boy's eyes flickered to the water, his parched lips parting slightly. For a long moment he hesitated. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, he accepted. Jonathan carefully lifted his head and helped him take a few sips. It was a small gesture, a tiny crack in the wall of fear and mistrust, but to Jonathan, it felt like the first ray of dawn after a long, dark night. The road ahead would be long, he knew. Healing, both physical and emotional, would take time, patience, and an abundance of care. But in that moment, as the Apache boy accepted water from his hand, a fragile seed of connection had been sown. The boy's physical recovery was a slow, arduous process, each small improvement a victory hard won. He remained wary, his dark eyes following Jonathan's and Mrs. Gable's every move, like a young hawk observing from a safe distance. He rarely made a sound, his silence a heavy cloak around him. Jonathan understood. The trauma he had endured was a chasm too deep to be bridged by mere words or hasty reassurances. Trust, if it were to come at all, would have to be earned, cultivated with the same patience he afforded his crops. He named the boy Naki, a word he'd heard once from a traveling trader, said to mean wanderer or one who walks about in an Apache dialect. It seemed fitting for a child found so lost and alone. Jonathan never pressed him to speak, never pushed for information about what had happened. Instead, he communicated through actions. He ensured Naki always had food, simple but nourishing meals prepared by Mrs. Gable. He kept the fire in the hearth burning warmly on the cooler nights. He moved about the house with a quiet predictability, hoping his steady presence would offer a sense of security. Naki spent much of his time on the settee, propped up with pillows, his gaze often drifting to the window, towards the distant, hazy mountains that were likely his home. Jonathan would sometimes find him staring at his own hands, his small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the rough blanket. What memories, what horrors, did those silent moments hold? Jonathan could only guess, and his heart ached for the boy's unspoken pain. One afternoon, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, whittling a piece of cottonwood. He was carving a small horse, its lines simple but evocative. Naki, who had been allowed to sit in a chair by the doorway, watched him, his expression unreadable. Jonathan worked in silence, the only sound the soft scrape of his knife against the wood. When he was finished, he sanded the carving smooth with a piece of worn leather, then held it out towards Naki. The boy flinched almost imperceptibly, his eyes darting from the wooden horse to Jonathan's face. Jonathan simply kept his hand outstretched, his expression gentle. Slowly, hesitantly, Naki reached out a slender hand and took the carving. His fingers closed around it, tracing the curve of its neck, the line of its back. He didn't look at Jonathan, but he didn't pull away. He held the small horse tightly, as if it were a precious talisman. It was a small thing, yet it felt monumental. A few days later, Naki took his first tentative steps since the fever. He was weak, his legs unsteady, but there was a flicker of determination in his eyes. Jonathan and Mrs. Gable watched, offering quiet encouragement but letting him find his own balance. He stumbled, caught himself on the edge of a table, and then, with a deep breath, took another step and another. Soon, he was able to move around the small farmhouse on his own, exploring its nooks and crannies with a silent curiosity. He'd pause before the bookshelf, his fingers ghosting over the spines of books he couldn't read. He'd stand by the window for long periods, his gaze fixed on the landscape outside. Jonathan began to include Naki in his daily routines, in small, non-threatening ways. When he went to feed the chickens, Naki would often follow, standing silently by the fence, watching. Jonathan would offer him a handful of grain, and after a few days, Naki began to scatter it for the birds, a faint, almost shy smile touching his lips as they flocked around his feet. These were the moments Jonathan cherished, tiny glimpses of the child beneath the layers of trauma and fear. He knew the wounds Naki carried were not just physical. The scars on his soul ran deep, but with each passing day, with each shared silence and unspoken understanding, Jonathan felt the fragile bonds of trust slowly, tentatively, beginning to form, like the first green shoots pushing through parched earth after a long-awaited rain. The ranch, once a place of Jonathan's solitary grief, was slowly transforming into a sanctuary, not just for him, but for the Apache boy he had come to care for as his own. The turning point came not with a grand gesture, but with a single whispered word. Naki had been steadily regaining strength, his movements becoming more confident, his silences less absolute. He would sometimes make small sounds of acknowledgement, a soft hum or a quiet sigh, but actual words remained locked away. Jonathan was mending a bridle in the barn, the scent of hay and leather comforting and familiar. Naki sat on an overturned bucket nearby, watching him, the carved wooden horse clutched in his hand. A shaft of sunlight pierced the dusty gloom, illuminating a spiderweb strung across a high beam. Jonathan, concentrating on a stubborn piece of stitching, pricked his finger. "Confound it!" he muttered, shaking his hand. Naki looked up, his dark eyes wide. He pointed to the small bead of blood welling on Jonathan's finger. Then, his lips moved, and a sound emerged, soft and hesitant. "Hurts." Jonathan froze, the needle slipping from his grasp. He stared at Naki, hardly daring to believe what he'd heard. It was English, heavily accented, but clear. "Yes, Naki," Jonathan said, his voice a little hoarse. "It hurts a bit." A small frown creased Naki's brow. He looked from Jonathan's finger to his own hand, then back again. "Jonathan," he said, sounding out the name slowly, carefully. A warmth spread through Jonathan's chest, so potent it almost brought tears to his eyes. It was the first time Naki had spoken his name. From that day forward, language began to bloom. Jonathan, with infinite patience, started teaching Naki simple English words. He'd point to objects: table, chair, horse, sky, and Naki would repeat them, his pronunciation gradually improving. Naki, in turn, sometimes offered Apache words, his eyes alight with a shy pride when Jonathan attempted to mimic the unfamiliar sounds. The boy began to venture further from the house, exploring the immediate surroundings of the ranch. He moved with a grace and silence that spoke of a life lived close to the earth. He had an uncanny ability to spot wildlife, a rabbit frozen in the grass, a hawk circling overhead, long before Jonathan noticed them. He showed Jonathan edible plants Jonathan had never known, his small hands gently plucking a berry or a root. It was a silent sharing of knowledge, a bridge between their two worlds. Yet, the shadows of the past still lingered. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the rumble of distant thunder caused Naki to flinch violently. He pressed himself into a corner, his eyes wide with a familiar terror, his breathing shallow. Jonathan went to him, speaking softly, reassuringly. "It's just thunder, Naki. Just the sky making noise. You're safe here." It took a long time for the boy's fear to subside. Jonathan realized then that the sound of thunder might be too close to the sound of gunfire, a trigger for the horrors he had witnessed. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to shield Naki from any further harm. He began to think about the town of Harmony Creek. Sooner or later, he would need supplies, and he couldn't leave Naki alone for long. But the thought of taking him into town, of exposing him to the inevitable prejudice and hostility, filled Jonathan with apprehension. He'd heard the whispers, the simmering resentment towards the Apache. He knew there were men in town, like the brash foreman from the Bar M Ranch, Jedediah Slade, who wouldn't hesitate to cause trouble. But Naki was growing stronger, more curious about the world beyond the ranch. And Jonathan knew he couldn't keep him hidden forever. He was his boy now, in all but blood, and he would stand by him no matter the cost. The decision was made. They would go to town. But Jonathan would be ready. He cleaned his old Colt Peacemaker, its familiar weight a grim reassurance in his hand. He hoped it wouldn't be needed, but he wouldn't be caught unprepared. The safety of Naki was paramount. The wagon rattled along the dusty track towards Harmony Creek, Jonathan holding the reins, Naki seated beside him, his small frame straight, his dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar landscape. He wore a new shirt and trousers Mrs. Gable had sewn for him, a little too large but clean and sturdy. His hair, now washed and neatly trimmed by Jonathan, shone like a raven's wing in the morning sun. He still clutched the small wooden horse. As they neared the town, the sounds of civilization grew louder, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the murmur of voices, the distant barking of a dog. Naki tensed, his gaze darting around, absorbing every detail. Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It'll be all right, Naki. Stay close to me." Harmony Creek was a typical frontier town. A single dusty main street lined with wooden storefronts, a saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office, and a church. As Jonathan guided the wagon down the street, heads began to turn. Whispers followed them like dry leaves skittering in the wind. He saw the narrowed eyes, the hostile stares directed at Naki. Jonathan kept his expression neutral, his gaze fixed ahead, but he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He pulled up in front of Peterson's general store. "Wait here," he told Naki, his voice firm but kind. As he climbed down from the wagon, a heavy-set man with a florid face and a sneer etched onto his lips stepped out from the saloon. It was Jedediah Slade, foreman of the Bar M, known for his brutish demeanor and his vocal hatred of Apaches. "Well, well, Muir," Slade drawled, his eyes flicking contemptuously towards Naki. "What have we got here? Looks like you picked up a stray pup. Or should I say, a whelp of a different kind." Several of Slade's cronies swaggered out behind him, their expressions mirroring his malice. Jonathan faced him squarely. "This is Naki, Slade. He's with me." "With you, is he?" Slade chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Since when did you become a squaw man, Muir? Taking in redskin brats?" Naki, though clearly frightened, sat very still, his chin held high. He looked at Jonathan, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a dawning understanding of the hatred directed at him. Jonathan felt a surge of cold anger. "He's a boy, Slade, and he's under my protection. You do well to remember that. Protection." Slade spat on the ground. "That there is Apache vermin, the kind that raids and kills decent folk. We should have wiped 'em all out." Just then, Doc Miller emerged from his office down the street. Seeing the confrontation, he hurried over, his face creased with concern. "Slade, leave them be. Jonathan's within his rights." "Stay out of this, Doc," Slade snarled. "This ain't your concern. It is when a child's welfare is at stake," Doc Miller retorted, his voice surprisingly firm. "And when common decency is being trampled in the dirt." Slade hesitated, clearly not wanting to cross the respected town doctor. He shot one last venomous look at Naki, then at Jonathan. "This ain't over, Muir. You mark my words. Bringing that thing here is asking for trouble." He and his men swaggered back into the saloon. Jonathan let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Doc Miller. "Thank you, Doc." "No thanks needed, Jonathan," the doctor said, his kind eyes resting on Naki. "Just doing what's right. But Slade's right about one thing. You need to be careful. There's a lot of bad blood in this town." Jonathan nodded grimly. He finished his shopping quickly, aware of the continued stares and muttered comments. As they rode out of Harmony Creek, Naki was silent for a long time. Then he looked up at Jonathan, his small face serious. "Slade bad man," he said, his English still halting. "Yes, Naki," Jonathan replied, his heart aching for the boy. "He is. But not everyone is like him." Naki seemed to ponder this. He looked at the vast expanse of the land around them, then back at Jonathan, a new understanding in his eyes. He had seen Jonathan stand up for him, defy the hatred. In that moment, the bond between them, already strong, deepened into something unbreakable. He had a protector, a champion. He was not alone. The whispers and the threat, however, hung in the air, a promise of future storms. The incident in town cast a long shadow over the peaceful rhythm of life at the ranch. Jonathan found himself more watchful, his senses constantly attuned to any unusual sound or movement. He kept his rifle closer at hand, and his nights were often disturbed by an uneasy vigilance. Naki, too, seemed more subdued, the blatant hostility he'd witnessed in Harmony Creek leaving an undeniable mark. Yet, it also seemed to solidify his trust in Jonathan. He stayed closer to the older man, his dark eyes often seeking Jonathan's, as if for reassurance. One evening, as Jonathan read by the firelight, Mrs. Gable voiced the concern that had been weighing on all their minds. "That Slade fellow," she said, her knitting needles clicking softly. "He's a troublemaker, Jonathan, and there are others like him. They won't easily forget that you're harboring, that you've taken Naki in." "I know, Martha," Jonathan said, lowering his book. "But Naki is here to stay. He's my responsibility. My son." The word, spoken aloud, felt right, natural. Mrs. Gable smiled softly. "He is a good boy, Jonathan. He deserves a chance at happiness." Weeks turned into a couple of months. The initial fear of an immediate reprisal from Slade or his ilk began to fade, replaced by a cautious routine. Naki was learning English rapidly, his quick mind absorbing new words and phrases like a thirsty sponge. He was also teaching Jonathan the names of desert plants in Apache, how to track animals, how to read the subtle signs of the weather in the clouds and the wind. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, as Jonathan and Naki were repairing a section of fence on the northern pasture, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. He was too far away to make out clearly, but there was something about his posture, the way he sat his horse, that sent a shiver of unease down Jonathan's spine. He raised his spyglass, his hands surprisingly steady. The rider was a white man, dressed in dusty, well-worn clothes, a rifle scabbard by his saddle. But it was his face, as it came into clearer focus, that made Jonathan's blood run cold. It was lean and cruel, with eyes like chips of ice, and a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jawline. Jonathan didn't know the man, but he exuded an air of predatory menace. He wasn't a local. He looked like a bounty hunter or worse. The man wasn't heading towards the main ranch house, but seemed to be scouting the perimeter, his gaze sweeping the land. Naki, seeing the tension in Jonathan, had gone still, his eyes fixed on the distant figure. "Who is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know, Naki," Jonathan said, lowering the spyglass, his mind racing. "But I don't like the look of him. Let's head back to the house and stay out of sight." They gathered their tools and made their way back, Jonathan's hand instinctively going to the Colt holstered at his hip. The rider eventually disappeared over a rise, but the sense of impending danger remained, thick and cloying as the summer heat. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the moonlit landscape, his thoughts troubled. Was this man connected to Naki's past? Had word somehow reached the perpetrators of the massacre that a survivor existed? The following day, the stranger reappeared, this time riding directly towards the ranch. Jonathan met him on the porch, Naki safely inside with Mrs. Gable, though he knew the boy would be watching, listening. The man dismounted, his movements economical and precise. "Name's Blackwood," he said, his voice raspy, like stones grinding together. "Silas Blackwood. I'm looking for someone." His cold eyes scanned Jonathan, then flickered towards the house. "Who might that be?" Jonathan asked, his tone even, betraying none of the apprehension he felt. "An Apache boy," Blackwood said, his lips curling into a semblance of a smile that held no warmth. "'Bout so high, dark hair, dark eyes. Might have been wounded. There's a reward for information leading to his recovery." Jonathan's heart hammered. This was it. The past had come calling. Jonathan Muir stood his ground on the porch, the weathered wood beneath his boots feeling suddenly like the deck of a ship in a storm. Silas Blackwood's gaze was like a physical weight, cold and assessing. The mention of a reward and recovery sent a chill through Jonathan, the euphemisms barely veiling a more sinister intent. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that Blackwood was not here to return a lost child to loving arms. "An Apache boy?" Jonathan repeated, his voice carefully neutral, buying himself a precious second to think. "Can't say I've seen any Apache children around here. This is ranching country, Mr. Blackwood. Not many of their people left in these parts." Blackwood's thin lips twisted. "Oh, I think you know the one I mean, Muir. Word travels. A boy, found near dead, taken in by a soft-hearted farmer." His eyes, like chips of obsidian, flickered towards the curtained window of the parlor, where Jonathan knew Naki was likely hidden, listening with bated breath. "There was an unfortunate incident some months back. A band of renegades. This boy, he's a witness. Potentially dangerous. Certain parties want him found." "Dangerous?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his calm a deliberate counterpoint to Blackwood's veiled threats. "He's just a child. What danger could a wounded boy pose?" "Children have ears, Muir. And tongues," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying an unmistakable menace. "Sometimes they see things they shouldn't, and sometimes they talk about them to the wrong people. It's better for everyone if such loose ends are tied up." The implication was clear, and it sickened Jonathan to his core. This man, and the certain parties he represented, wanted to silence Naki permanently. His protective instinct, already fierce, blazed into a cold, hard resolve. "There's no such boy here, Blackwood," Jonathan stated, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You've wasted a ride." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his hand casually resting near the butt of the pistol holstered on his hip. "I don't like being lied to, Muir. I have it on good authority the boy is here. Perhaps a look inside would refresh your memory." "This is my property, Blackwood," Jonathan said, his own hand drifting towards his Colt. "And you're not welcome to search it. I'd advise you to mount up and ride out." For a tense moment, the two men locked gazes, the unspoken challenge hanging heavy in the air. The chirping of crickets in the nearby grass seemed unnaturally loud. Blackwood was a predator used to intimidation and violence. But Jonathan, though a man of peace, possessed a core of unyielding strength, forged in loss and tempered by a deep sense of justice. He would not back down. Not when Naki's life was at stake. Blackwood's lips curled into a sneer. "Playing the hero, old man? It won't end well for you. Or the boy. That's my concern, not yours," Jonathan replied steadily. "Now, I won't ask you again. Leave." Suddenly, the screen door creaked open. Naki stepped out onto the porch, his small face pale but resolute. He stood beside Jonathan, his hand instinctively reaching for the older man's leg, clutching the fabric of his trousers. "I am here," Naki said, his voice surprisingly clear, though trembling slightly. "Leave him alone." Blackwood's eyes lit with a cruel triumph. Well, what have we here?" "Speak of the devil." He took a step towards Naki, but Jonathan moved instantly, positioning himself between the boy and the bounty hunter. "You will not touch him," Jonathan said, his voice a low growl. The air crackled with tension, the confrontation rapidly escalating towards a point of no return. Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway, a shotgun held firmly in her capable hands, its twin barrels pointed squarely at Blackwood's chest. "I think you heard Mr. Muir," she said, her voice steely. "Time for you to be on your way." Silas Blackwood's predatory gaze flickered from Jonathan to Naki, then to Mrs. Gable and the unwavering barrels of her shotgun. A muscle twitched in his scarred cheek. He was clearly accustomed to his targets being cowed, his authority unquestioned. This united front of a determined farmer, a brave boy, and a resolute woman with a firearm clearly gave him pause. "So, the whole family's out to protect the little savage," Blackwood sneered, though some of the confidence had leached from his tone. "Touching, but misguided." "There's nothing misguided about protecting a child from men like you," Jonathan retorted, his eyes hard as flint. "Naki is not a savage. He's a boy who has suffered more than you could ever comprehend, and he's under my roof, which makes him my kin. My son." The word son hung in the air, a declaration of unwavering loyalty. Naki looked up at Jonathan, his dark eyes shining with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and a fierce, burgeoning pride. He squeezed Jonathan's leg tighter. Blackwood scoffed. "Your son? You think you can just claim him? He belongs to his people, or to those who have a prior claim on him. His people were slaughtered." Jonathan's voice rose, laced with a righteous fury, "by men who value a bounty more than a human life. His only claim now is to a life of peace and safety, and by God, I'll see he gets it." Blackwood's hand twitched towards his gun. "You're making a mistake, Muir. A fatal 1-inch. The only mistake here was you thinking you could ride onto my land and threaten my family," Jonathan countered, his own hand now firmly on the butt of his Colt. The standoff stretched for another agonizing moment. The sun beat down, the silence broken only by the buzzing of a horsefly and Blackwood's ragged breathing. Then, with a curse, Blackwood slowly raised his hands, a gesture of grudging, temporary surrender. "This isn't over," he snarled, his eyes promising retribution. "I'll be back, and when I return, I won't be alone." He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off them, mounted his horse with a jerky movement, and wheeled the animal around. He galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a lingering miasma of threat in his wake. As his figure receded into the distance, Jonathan finally let out a shaky breath. He turned to Naki, kneeling and pulling the boy into a fierce embrace. "You were brave, Naki." So brave, Naki clung to him, his small body trembling. He wanted to hurt me," he whispered. "I won't let him," Jonathan vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never let anyone hurt you again. You are safe here. You are my son, Naki." "My son," Mrs. Gable lowered the shotgun, her face pale but her expression resolute. "He'll be back, Jonathan. Men like that don't give up easily." "I know," Jonathan said grimly, rising to his feet, Naki still holding his hand. "We need to be ready. And perhaps we won't be alone either." He thought of Doc Miller, of the few other decent folk in Harmony Creek who might stand against such blatant injustice. The confrontation had been terrifying, but it had also forged their bond into something immutable. They had faced the darkness together, and in doing so, had solidified their new family. A family born not of blood, but of courage, compassion, and an unshakable love. The storm had passed for now, but the thunder of its return echoed in the distance. The years that followed were etched with the quiet rhythm of the land and the steady growth of a family forged in adversity. Silas Blackwood never returned, nor did the certain parties he represented. Perhaps the united front at the Muir Ranch had given them pause, or perhaps other, more pressing matters had diverted their cruel attentions. Jonathan, however, never fully lowered his guard, but the immediate, sharp-edged fear gradually softened into a vigilant awareness. Life on the ranch settled into a new normal, one enriched by Naki's presence. The boy, who became a young man under Jonathan's patient tutelage, blossomed. He learned to read and write English, devouring the books on Jonathan's shelves with an insatiable curiosity. He excelled at ranch work, his innate understanding of the land and animals making him an invaluable partner to Jonathan. He never forgot his Apache heritage, and Jonathan encouraged him to honor it. Naki would often speak of the traditions of his people, the stories his grandmother had told him, the skills his father had taught him. He carved beautiful figures from wood, not just horses, but eagles, wolves, and bison, each piece imbued with a spirit and artistry that was uniquely his. He learned to balance the two worlds he now inhabited, blending the wisdom of his ancestors with the knowledge he gained from Jonathan and the books he read. The ranch prospered. With Naki's energy and insights, they expanded their acreage, their herds grew, and their crops flourished. Jonathan, his face now deeply lined but his eyes bright with contentment, watched Naki grow into a man of quiet strength, integrity, and deep compassion. The townsfolk of Harmony Creek, initially suspicious, gradually came to respect the young man Naki had become. His skill with horses was legendary, and his willingness to help a neighbor in need, a trait learned from Jonathan, slowly eroded the prejudice that had once greeted him. Doc Miller remained a steadfast friend, and even Jedediah Slade, mellowed by age and perhaps a grudging respect, offered a curt nod of acknowledgement when they passed. Naki, in time, found love. He married Sarah, the schoolteacher's daughter, a kind and intelligent young woman who saw the goodness in his heart and admired the quiet strength of his spirit. Their wedding, held under the vast desert sky at the Muir Ranch, was a celebration of love and the enduring power of hope. Jonathan, his heart full, stood as Naki's father, tears of pride and joy in his eyes. Grandchildren soon filled the ranch with laughter, their mixed heritage a beautiful tapestry woven from two distinct cultures. They listened, wide-eyed, as Jonathan, now an old man with a flowing white beard, told them the story of how he found a bullet-riddled Apache boy in his field, a boy who became his son and transformed his life. He spoke of courage, of chosen family, and of the enduring truth that compassion is a far greater force than hatred. Jonathan Muir lived to see his legacy take root and flourish, a legacy not of wealth or land, but of love, acceptance, and the unbreakable bonds of a family created against all odds. When he finally passed, peacefully in his sleep, it was Naki who held his hand, Naki who carried on his values, ensuring that the ranch remained a sanctuary of hope and a testament to the transformative power of one man's decision to open his heart. The story of Jonathan Muir and Naki, the Apache boy he raised as his own, became a quiet legend in that corner of Arizona, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, the seeds of kindness, if nurtured, can grow into something truly extraordinary, a beacon for generations to come. Their lives, intertwined by fate and forged by love, proved that family is not solely defined by blood, but by the courage to protect, the willingness to understand, and the enduring strength of the human heart.